Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the November 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Report on an Investigation of the Peasant Movement in Hunan, March 1927, by Mao. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this is one of the earliest notable works by Mao that we have up on the channel. 1927 is just 6 years after the founding of the Communist Party of China. And for historical background, what was going on in China at this time is that there had been the Xinhai Revolution in 1911. That brought down the Chinese monarchy. The last Chinese dynasty was the Qing dynasty, and in its absence, in the north of China in particular, there was kind of a power vacuum. And to fill that vacuum emerged a system of warlords. So this is the period of warlordism in China. Both the Communist Party of China and the more right-wing party, the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, they would join forces to combat warlordism. And then once the warlords had more or less been subdued, eventually they would turn on each other because this united front between the communists and the nationalists was not sustainable. They really wanted different things. In fact, the Soviets would try to intervene in and oversee this relationship. They feared that the Communist Party was too small to complete a socialist revolution. So they tried to make sure that there was this united front, but they also tried to keep the nationalists in check. Anyway, around this time, 1927, they would turn on each other, and then the Chinese Civil War would last from 1927 to 1949, of course, happily with the communists emerging victorious. Now, a lot would happen between 1927 and 1949. This was a really significant couple of decades for Chinese history and for Chinese communist history. In particular, we'll get to that as we cover more of Mao's writings from this period. Of course, that covers in the late 30s, the invasion of China by Japan, and the Second Sino-Japanese War, World War II, etc. So, a lot to discuss in that time. So, back to this text. It's hosted at the Marxists' Internet Archive, marxists.org, and although there aren't any notes on this on the original source and etc., there is an editor's note from MIA. So let's read that. This article was written as a reply to the carping criticisms, both inside and outside the party, then being leveled at the peasants' revolutionary struggle. Comrade Mao Zedong spent 32 days in Hunan province making an investigation and wrote this report in order to answer these criticisms. The right opportunists in the party, headed by Chen Jushu, would not accept his views and stuck to their own wrong ideas. Their chief error was that, frightened by the reactionary trend in the Kuomintang, they dared not support the great revolutionary struggles of the peasants, which had erupted or were erupting. To appease the Kuomintang, they preferred to desert the peasantry, their chief ally in the revolution, and thus left the working class and the Communist Party isolated and without help. It was mainly because it was able to exploit this weakness within the Communist Party that the Kuomintang dared to betray the revolution, launch its party purge, and make war on the people in the summer of 1927. So, we're now going to begin the first section of the text. As always in these longer texts, if someone out there would like to leave timestamps for the beginning of each section, starting with the reading of the title, that would be great, and I'll put it in the video description. First section. The importance of the peasant problem. During my recent visit to Hunan, I made a first-hand investigation of conditions in the 5 counties of Xiangdan, Shangxiang, Hongshan, Liling, and Changsha. In the 32 days from January 4 to February 5, I called together fact-finding conferences in villages and county towns, which were attended by experienced peasants and by comrades working in the peasant movement. And I listened attentively to their reports and collected a great deal of material. Many of the hows and whys of the peasant movement were the exact opposite of what the gentry in Hankow and Changsha are saying. I saw and heard of many strange things of which I had hitherto been unaware. I believe the same is true of many other places, too. All talk directed against the peasant movement must be speedily set right. All the wrong measures taken by the revolutionary authorities concerning the peasant movement must be speedily changed. Only thus can the future of the revolution be benefited. For the present upsurge of the peasant movement is a colossal event. In a very short time, in China's central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash all the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will sweep all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into their graves. Every revolutionary party and every revolutionary comrade will be put to the test, to be accepted or rejected as they decide. There are three alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force you to make that choice quickly. And there's a footnote off of that section. Hunan province was then the center of the peasant movement in China. Next section, get organized. The development of the peasant movement in Hunan may be divided roughly into two periods with respect to the counties in the province's central and southern parts, where the movement has already made much headway. The first, from January to September of last year, was one of organization. In this period, January to June was a time of underground activity, and July to September, when the Revolutionary Army was driving out Chao Hung-ti, one of open activity. There's a footnote there. Chao Hung-ti was the ruler of Hunan at that time. He was the agent of the northern warlords. He was overthrown by the Northern Expeditionary Army in 1926. The Northern Expeditionary Army was that joint effort between the CPC and the nationalists. During this period, the membership of the peasant associations did not exceed 300,000 to 400,000. The masses directly under their leadership numbered little more than 1 million. There was, as yet, hardly any struggle in the rural areas, and consequently there was very little criticism of the associations in other circles. Since its members served as guides, scouts, and carriers of the Northern Expeditionary Army, even some of the officers had a good word to say for the peasant associations. The second period, from last October to January of this year, was one of revolutionary action. The membership of the associations jumped to 2 million, and the masses directly under their leadership increased to 10 million. Since the peasants generally enter only one name for the whole family on joining a peasant association, a membership of 2 million means a mass following of about 10 million. Almost half the peasants in Hunan are now organized. In counties like Xiangdan, Shaanxi, Liuyang, Changsha, Liling, Ningxiang, Pingyang, Xiangin, Hengshan, Hengyang, Leiyang, Chenshen, and Anhua, nearly all the peasants have combined in the peasant associations or have come under their leadership. It was on the strength of their extensive organization that the peasants went into action and within 4 months brought about a great revolution in the countryside, a revolution without parallel in history. Next section. Down with the local tyrants and evil gentry. All power to the peasant associations. The main targets of attack by the peasants are the local tyrants, the evil gentry, and the lawless landlords. But in passing, they also hit out against patriarchal ideas and institutions, against the corrupt officials in the cities, and against bad practices and customs in the rural areas. Quick note there, of course, for everybody as I record this in November 2021, trying to wrestle with the whole, quote, conservative communist movement, a bunch of total nonsense, trying to assert itself in the U.S. right now. In my opinion, it's to stop a rising socialist movement. Hit out against patriarchal ideas and institutions. They're trying to take those things down. So all the anti-feminist communists, etc., forget about it. All right. In force and momentum, the attack is tempestuous. Those who bow before it survive, and those who resist perish. As a result, the privileges which the feudal landlords enjoyed for thousands of years are being shattered to pieces. Every bit of the dignity and prestige built up by the landlords is being swept into the dust. With the collapse of the power of the landlords, the peasant associations have now become the sole organs of authority, and the popular slogan, "All power to the peasant associations," has become a reality. Even bides such as a quarrel between husband and wife are brought to the peasant association. Nothing can be settled unless someone from the peasant association is present. The association actually dictates all rural affairs, and quite literally, whatever it says goes. Those who are outside the associations can only speak well of them and cannot say anything against them. The local tyrants, evil gentry, and lawless landlords have been deprived of all right to speak, and none of them dares even mutter dissent. In the face of the peasant association's power and pressure, the top local tyrants and evil gentry have fled to Shanghai, those of the second rank to Hankow, and those of the third rank to Changsha, and those of the fourth to the county towns, while the fifth rank and the still lesser fry surrender to the peasant associations in the villages. Here's 10 yuan. Please let me join the peasant association, one of the smaller of the evil gentry will say. Who wants your filthy money? The peasants reply. Many middle and small landlords and rich peasants, and even some middle peasants, who were all formerly opposed to the peasant associations, are now vainly seeking admission. Visiting various places, I often came across such people who pleaded with me, "Mr. Committeeman from the provincial capital, please be my sponsor." In the Qing dynasty, the household census compiled by the local authorities consisted of a regular register and the other register, the former for honest people and the latter for burglars, bandits, and similar undesirables. In some places, the peasants now use this method to scare those who formerly opposed the associations. They say, put their names down in the other register. Afraid of being entered in the other register, such people try various devices to gain admission into the peasant associations, on which their minds are so set that they do not feel safe until their names are entered. But more often than not, they are turned down flat, and so they are always on tenterhooks. With the doors of the association barred to them, they are like tramps without a home, or, in rural parlance, mere trash. In short, what was looked down upon 4 months ago as a gang of peasants has now become a most honorable institution. Those who formerly prostrated themselves before the power of the gentry now bow before the power of the peasants. No matter what their identity, all admit that the world since last October is a different one. Next section. It's terrible, or it's fine. The peasants' revolt disturbed the gentry's sweet dreams. When the news from the countryside reached the cities, it caused immediate uproar among the gentry. Soon after my arrival in Changsha, I met all sorts of people and picked up a good deal of gossip. From the middle social strata upwards to the Kuomintang right-wingers, there was not a single person who did not sum up the whole business in the phrase, "It's terrible." Under the impact of the views of the "it's terrible" school, then flooding the city, even quite revolutionary-minded people became downhearted as they pictured the events in the countryside in their mind's eye, and they were unable to deny the word terrible. Even quite progressive people said, though terrible, it is inevitable in a revolution. In short, nobody could altogether deny the word terrible, but, as already mentioned, the fact is that the great peasant masses have risen to fulfill their historic mission, and that the forces of rural democracy have risen to overthrow the forces of rural feudalism. The patriarchal feudal class of local tyrants, evil gentry, and lawless landlords has formed the basis of autocratic government for thousands of years and is the cornerstone of imperialism, warlordism, and corrupt officialdom. To overthrow these feudal forces is the real objective of the national revolution. In a few months, the peasants have accomplished what Dr. Sun Yat-sen wanted, but failed to accomplish in the 40 years he devoted to the national revolution. This is a marvelous feat never before achieved, not just in 40, but in thousands of years. It's fine. It is not terrible at all. It is anything but terrible. It's terrible is obviously a theory for combating the rise of the peasants in the interests of the landlords. It is obviously a theory of the landlord class for preserving the old order of feudalism and obstructing the establishment of the new order of democracy. It is obviously a counter-revolutionary theory. No revolutionary comrade should echo this nonsense. If your revolutionary viewpoint is firmly established, and if you have been to the villages and looked around, you will undoubtedly feel thrilled as never before. Countless thousands of the enslaved, the peasants, are striking down the enemies who battened on their flesh. What the peasants are doing is absolutely right. What they're doing is fine. It's fine is the theory of the peasants and of all other revolutionaries. Every revolutionary comrade should know that the national revolution requires a great change in the countryside. The revolution of 1911 did not bring about this change, hence its failure. This change is now taking place, and it is an important factor for the completion of the revolution. Every revolutionary comrade must support it, or he will be taking the stand of counter-revolution. There's a footnote there. The revolution of 1911, comment we talked about this before, overthrew the autocratic regime of the Qing dynasty. In October of that year, a section of the Qing dynasty's new army staged an uprising in Wuchang, Hubei province, at the urging of bourgeois and petty bourgeois revolutionary societies. It was followed by uprisings in other provinces, and very soon, the rule of the Qing dynasty crumbled. On January 1, 1912, the Provisional Government of the Republic of China was set up in Nanking, and Sun Yat-sen was elected provisional president. The revolution achieved victory through the alliance of the bourgeoisie with the peasants, workers, and urban petty bourgeoisie. But state power fell into the hands of the northern warlord, Yuan Shikai, and the revolution failed, because the group which led it was conciliationist in nature, failed to give real benefits to the peasants, and yielded to imperialist and feudal pressure. So that's the end of that section. Next section, the question of going too far. Then there's another section of people who say, yes, peasant associations are necessary, but they're going rather too far. This is the opinion of the middle of the roaders. But what's the actual situation? True, the peasants are in a sense unruly in the countryside. Supreme in authority, the peasant association allows the landlord no say and sweeps away his prestige. This amounts to striking the landlord down to the dust and keeping him there. The peasants threaten, "We will put you in the other register." They fine the local tyrants and evil gentry, they demand contributions from them, and they smash their sedan chairs. People swarm into the houses of local tyrants and evil gentry who are against the peasant association, slaughter their pigs, and consume their grain. They even loll for a minute or two on the ivory inlaid beds belonging to the young ladies in the households of the local tyrants and evil gentry. At the slightest provocation, they make arrests, crown the arrested with tall paper hats, and parade them through the villages, saying, "You dirty landlords, now you know who we are." Doing whatever they like, and turning everything upside down, they've created a kind of terror in the countryside. This is what some people call going too far, or exceeding the proper limits and righting a wrong, or really too much. Comment, I would call that what sounds like a really good time. Such talk may seem plausible, but in fact it is wrong. First, the local tyrants, evil gentry, and lawless landlords have themselves driven the peasants to this. For ages, they've used their power to tyrannize over the peasants and trample them underfoot. That is why the peasants have reacted so strongly. The most violent revolts and the most serious disorders have invariably occurred in places where the local tyrants, evil gentry, and lawless landlords perpetrated the worst outrages. The peasants are clear-sighted. Who is bad and who is not, who is the worst and who is not quite so vicious, who deserves severe punishment and who deserves to be let off more lightly. The peasants keep clear accounts, and very seldom has the punishment exceeded the crime. Secondly, a revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. A rural revolution is a revolution by which the peasantry overthrows the power of the feudal landlord class. Without using the greatest force, the peasants cannot possibly overthrow the deep-rooted authority of the landlords, which has lasted for thousands of years. The rural areas need a mighty revolutionary upsurge, for it alone can rouse the people in their millions to become a powerful force. All the actions mentioned here, which might have been labeled as going too far, flow from the power of the peasants, which has been called forth by the mighty revolutionary upsurge in the countryside. It was highly necessary for such things to be done in the second period of the peasant movement, the period of revolutionary action. In this period, it was necessary to establish the absolute authority of the peasants. It was necessary to forbid malicious criticism of the peasant associations. It was necessary to overthrow the whole authority of the gentry, to strike them to the ground and keep them there. To put it bluntly, it is necessary to create terror for a while in every rural area, or otherwise it would be impossible to suppress the activities of the counter-revolutionaries in the countryside or overthrow the authority of the gentry. Proper limits have to be exceeded in order to right a wrong, or else the wrong cannot be righted. Those who talk about the peasants going too far seem at first sight to be different from those who say it's terrible, as mentioned earlier, but in essence they proceed from the same standpoint, and likewise voice a landlord theory that upholds the interests of the privileged classes. Since this theory impedes the rise of the peasant movement and so disrupts the revolution, we must firmly oppose it. So that's the end of that section. There's a couple of footnotes. That whole list of being refined, leisurely and gentle, temperate, etc., those were the virtues of Confucius as described by one of his disciples. Also, the old Chinese phrase, exceeding the proper limits and righting a wrong, was often quoted for the purpose of restricting people's activities, reforms that remained within the framework of the established order being permitted, but activities aiming at the complete destruction of the old order being forbidden. So actions within this framework were regarded as proper, but those that aimed at completely destroying the old order were described as exceeding the proper limits. It's a convenient doctrine for reformists and opportunists in the revolutionary ranks. Comrade Mao Zedong refuted this kind of reformist doctrine. So next section, the movement of the riffraff. The right wing of the Kuomintang says, the peasant movement is a movement of the riffraff, of the lazy peasants. This view is current in Changsha. When I was in the countryside, I heard the gentry say, it's all right to set up peasant associations, but the people now running them are no good. They ought to be replaced. This opinion comes to the same thing as what the right-wingers are saying. According to both, it's all right to have a peasant movement. The movement is already in being, and no one dare say otherwise. But they say that the people running it are no good, and they particularly hate those in charge of the associations at the lower levels, calling them riffraff. In short, all those whom the gentry had despised, those whom they had trodden into the dirt, people with no place in society, people with no right to speak, have now audaciously lifted up their heads. They have not only lifted up their heads, but have taken power into their hands. They're now running the township peasant associations at the lowest level, which they have turned into something fierce and formidable. They have raised their rough, work-soiled hands and laid them on the gentry. They tether the evil gentry with ropes, crown them with tall paper hats, and parade them through the villages. In Xiangdan and Xiangxiang, they call this parading through the township, and in Luling, parading through the fields. Not a day passes but they drum some harsh, pitiless words of denunciation into these gentry's ears. They are issuing orders and are running everything. Those who used to rank lowest now rank above everybody else, and so this is called turning things upside down. End of that section. Next section, vanguards of the revolution. Where there are two opposite approaches to things and people, two opposite views emerge. It's terrible, and it's fine. Riffraff, and vanguards of the revolution. Here are apt examples. We said above that the peasants have accomplished a revolutionary task, which had been left unaccomplished for many years, and have done an important job for the national revolution. But has this great revolutionary task, this important revolutionary work, been performed by all the peasants? No. There are three kinds of peasants: the rich, the middle, and the poor peasants. The three live in different circumstances, and so have different views about the revolution. In the first period, what appealed to the rich peasants was the talk about the northern expeditionary armies sustaining a crushing defeat in Jiangxi, about Chiang Kai-shek's being wounded in the leg and flying back to Guangdong, and about Wu Peifu's recapturing Yueqiao. The peasant associations would certainly not last, and the three people's principles could never prevail, because they had never been heard of before. Quick break for 4 footnotes. Chiang Kai-shek had not yet been fully exposed as a counter-revolutionary in the winter of 1926 and the spring of 1927, when the Northern Expeditionary Army was marching into the Yangtze Valley, and the peasant masses still thought that he was for the revolution. The landlords and rich peasants disliked him and spread the rumor that the Northern Expeditionary Army had suffered defeats and that he had been wounded in the leg. Chiang Kai-shek came to be fully revealed as a counter-revolutionary on April 12, 1927. So comment, that's a month after this, when he staged his counter-revolutionary coup d'etat in Shanghai and elsewhere, massacring the workers, suppressing the peasants, and attacking the Communist Party. The landlords and rich peasants then changed their attitude and began to support him. Next note, Guangdong was the first revolutionary base in the period of the First Revolutionary Civil War, 1924 to 1927. Next, Wu Peifu was one of the best known of the northern warlords. Together with Cao Kun, who was notorious for his rigging of the presidential election in 1923 by bribing members of parliament, he belonged to the Qili Hope clique. He supported Cao as the leader, and the two were generally referred to as Cao Wu. In 1920, after defeating Duan Shijui, warlord of the Anhui clique, Wu Peifu gained control of the northern warlord government in Peking as an agent of the Anglo-American imperialists. It was he who gave the orders for the massacre on February 7, 1923, of the workers on strike along the Peking-Hankow Railway. In 1924, he was defeated in the war with Chang Tso-lin, commonly known as the War between the Chili and Fengtian cliques, and he was thereupon ousted from the Peking regime. In 1926, he joined forces with Chang Tso-lin at the instigation of the Japanese and British imperialists, and thus returned to power. When the Northern Expeditionary Army drove northward from Guangdong in 1926, he was the first foe to be overthrown. Finally, the Three People's Principles were Sun Yat-sen's principles and program for the bourgeois democratic revolution in China on the questions of nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. In 1924, in the manifesto of the First National Congress of the Kuomintang, Sun Yat-sen restated the Three People's Principles, interpreting nationalism as opposition to imperialism and expressing active support for the movements of the workers and peasants. The old Three People's Principles thus developed into the new, consisting of the three great policies, that is, alliance with Russia, comment, now under Soviet leadership, cooperation with the Communist Party, and assistance to the peasants and workers. The new Three People's Principles provided the political basis for cooperation between the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang during the First Revolutionary Civil War period. Okay, end of footnotes, back to the main text. Thus, an official of the Township Peasant Association, generally one of the riffraff type, would walk into the house of a rich peasant, register in hand, and say, "Will you please join the Peasant Association?" How would the rich peasant answer? A tolerably well-behaved one would say, "Peasant Association? I've lived here for decades, tilling my land. I've never heard of such a thing before, yet I've managed to live all right. I advise you to give it up." A really vicious rich peasant would say, "Peasant Association? Nonsense. Association for getting your head chopped off. Don't get people into trouble." Yet, surprisingly enough, the peasant associations have now been established for several months, and have even dared to stand up to the gentry. The gentry of the neighborhood, who refused to surrender their opium pipes, were arrested by the associations and paraded through the villages. In the county towns, moreover, some big landlords were put to death, like Yun Jung-chu of Xiangdan and Yang Chi-tse of Ningxiang. On the anniversary of the October Revolution, at the time of the anti-British rally, and of the great celebrations of the victory of the Northern Expedition, tens of thousands of peasants in every township, holding high their banners, big and small, along with their carrying poles and hoes, demonstrated in massive, streaming columns. It was only then that the rich peasants began to get perplexed and alarmed. During the great victory celebrations of the Northern Expedition, they learned that Qiuqiang had been taken, that Chiang Kai-shek had not been wounded in the leg, and that Wu Peifu had been defeated after all. What is more, they saw such slogans as "Long live the Three People's Principles," "Long live the Peasant Associations," and "Long live the Peasants," clearly written on the red and green proclamations. What? Wondered the rich peasants, greatly perplexed and alarmed. Long live the peasants! Are these people now to be regarded as emperors? So the peasant associations are putting on grand airs. People from the associations say to the rich peasants, "We'll enter you in the other register," or, in another month, the admission fee will be 10 yuan a head. Only under the impact of all this are the rich peasants tardily joining the associations, some paying 50 cents or a yuan for admission, the regular fee being a mere 10 coppers. Some securing admission only after asking other people to put in a good word for them. But there are quite a number of diehards who have not joined to this day. When the rich peasants join the associations, they generally enter the name of some 60 or 70-year-old member of the family, for they're in constant dread of conscription. After joining, the rich peasants are not keen on doing any work for the associations. They remain inactive throughout. And there are two footnotes off of that section. The Chinese term for long live is wan sui, literally 10,000 years, and was the traditional salute to the emperor. It had become a synonym for emperor. Also, rich peasants should not have been allowed to join the peasant associations, a point which the peasant masses did not yet understand in 1927. Back to the main text. How about the middle peasants? Theirs is a vacillating attitude. They think that the revolution will not bring them much good. They have rice cooking in their pots, and no creditors knocking on their doors at midnight. They too, judging a thing by whether it ever existed before, knit their brows and think to themselves, can the peasant associations really last? Can the three people's principles prevail? Their conclusion is, afraid not. They imagine it all depends on the will of heaven, and think, a peasant association? Who knows if heaven wills it or not? Comment, boy, is this just like today? You know, technology has changed, but class relationships, that persists. Honestly, these things are so similar. It really takes a revolution to change any of this. In the first period, people from the association would call on a middle peasant, register in hand, and say, will you please join the peasant association? The middle peasant would reply, there's no hurry. It was not until the second period, when the peasant associations were already exercising great power, that the middle peasants came in. They show up better in the associations than the rich peasants, but are not as yet very enthusiastic. They still want to wait and see. It's essential for the peasant associations to get the middle peasants to join, and to do a good deal more explanatory work among them. The poor peasants have always been the main force in the bitter fight in the countryside. They have fought militantly through the 2 periods of underground work and of open activity. They are the most responsive to Communist Party leadership. They are deadly enemies of the camp of the local tyrants and evil gentry, and attack it without the slightest hesitation. We joined the peasant association long ago, they say to the rich peasants. Why are you still hesitating? The rich peasants answer mockingly, what is there to keep you from joining? You people have neither a tile over your heads, nor a speck of land under your feet. It is true that the poor peasants are not afraid of losing anything. Many of them really have neither a tile over their heads, nor a speck of land under their feet. What indeed is there to keep them from joining the associations? According to the survey of Changsha County, the poor peasants comprise 70%, the middle peasants 20%, and the landlords and the rich peasants 10% of the population in the rural areas. The 70%, the poor peasants, may be subdivided into 2 categories, the utterly destitute and the less destitute. The utterly destitute, comprising 20%, are the completely dispossessed. That is, people who have neither land nor money, are without any means of livelihood, and are forced to leave home and become mercenaries or hired laborers or wandering beggars. The less destitute, the other 50%, are the partially dispossessed. That is, people with just a little land or little money who eat up more than they earn and live in toil and distress the year round, such as the handicraftsmen, the tenant peasants, not including the rich tenant peasants, and the semi-owner peasants. This great mass of poor peasants, or altogether 70% of the rural population, are the backbone of the peasant associations, the vanguard in the overthrow of the feudal forces, and the heroes who have performed the great revolutionary task, which for long years was left undone. A couple of footnotes there. First, here the utterly destitute means the farm laborers, or the rural proletariat, and the rural lumpen proletariat. Also, the less destitute means the rural semi-proletariat. Back to the text. Without the poor peasant class, or the riffraff as the gentry call them, it would have been impossible to bring about the present revolutionary situation in the countryside, or to overthrow the local tyrants and evil gentry and complete the democratic revolution. The poor peasants, being the most revolutionary group, have gained the leadership of the peasant associations. In both the first and second periods, almost all the chairmen and committee members in the peasant associations at the lowest level were poor peasants. Of the officials in the township associations in Hunan County, the utterly destitute comprise 50%, the less destitute 40%, and poverty-stricken intellectuals 10%. Leadership by the poor peasants is absolutely necessary. Without the poor peasants, there would be no revolution. To deny their role is to deny the revolution. To attack them is to attack the revolution. They have never been wrong on the general direction of the revolution. They have discredited the local tyrants and evil gentry. They've beaten down the local tyrants and evil gentry, big and small, and kept them underfoot. Many of their deeds in the period of revolutionary action, which were labeled as going too far, were in fact the very things the revolution required. Some county governments, county headquarters of the Kuomintang, and county peasant associations in Hunan have already made a number of mistakes. Some have even sent soldiers to arrest officials of the lower level associations at the landlord's request. A good many chairmen and committee members of township associations in Hongshan and Xiangxiang counties have been thrown in jail. This mistake is very serious and feeds the arrogance of the reactionaries. To judge whether or not it is a mistake, you only have to see how joyful the lawless landlords have become and how reactionary sentiments grow wherever the chairman or committee members of local peasant associations are arrested. We must combat the counter-revolutionary talk of a movement of riffraff and a movement of lazy peasants, and must be especially careful not to commit the error of helping the local tyrants and evil gentry in their attacks on the poor peasant class. Though a few of the poor peasant leaders undoubtedly did have shortcomings, most of them have changed by now. They themselves are energetically prohibiting gambling and suppressing banditry. Where the peasant association is powerful, gambling has stopped altogether and banditry has vanished. In some places, it is literally true that people do not take any articles left by the wayside, and that doors are not bolted at night. According to the Hongshan survey, 85% of the poor peasant leaders have made great progress and have proved themselves capable and hardworking. Only 15% retain some bad habits. The most one can call these is an unhealthy minority, and we must not echo the local tyrants and evil gentry in undiscriminatingly condemning them as riffraff. This problem of the unhealthy minority can be tackled only under the Peasant Association's own slogan of strengthen discipline, by carrying on propaganda among the masses, by educating the unhealthy minority, and by tightening the association's discipline. In no circumstances should soldiers be arbitrarily sent to make arrests, as would damage the prestige of the poor peasants and feed the arrogance of the local tyrants and evil gentry. This point requires particular attention. End of that section, beginning of the next section. The 14 Great Achievements. Most critics of the peasant associations allege that they have done a great many bad things. I've already pointed out that the peasants' attack on the local tyrants and evil gentry is entirely revolutionary behavior and in no way blameworthy. The peasants have done a great many things, and in order to answer people's criticism, we must closely examine all their activities, one by one, to see what they have actually done. I have classified and summed up their activities of the last few months. In all, the peasants, under the leadership of the peasant associations, have the following 14 great achievements to their credit. So here the rest of the text is basically just divided into these 14 subsections, so I'll read the title. Anyone doing timestamps, just be aware these are significant. 1. Organizing the peasants into peasant associations. This is the first great achievement of the peasants. In counties like Xiangdan, Xiangxiang, and Hongshan, nearly all the peasants are organized, and there is hardly a remote corner where they are not on the move. These are the best places. In some counties, like Yiyang and Huazhong, the bulk of the peasants are organized, with only a small section remaining unorganized. These places are in the second grade. In other counties, like Chengpu and Lingling, where a small section is organized, the bulk of the peasants remain unorganized. These places are in the third grade. Western Hunan, which is under the control of Yuan Tsuming, has not yet been reached by the association's propaganda, and in many of its counties the peasants are completely unorganized. These form a fourth grade. Roughly speaking, the counties in central Hunan, with Changsha as the center, are the most advanced. Those in southern Hunan come second, and western Hunan is only just beginning to organize. According to the figures compiled by the Provincial Peasant Association last November, organizations with a total membership of 1,367,727 have been set up in 37 of the province's 75 counties. Of these members, about 1 million were organized during October and November, when the power of the associations rose high, while up to September the membership had only been 300,000 to 400,000. Then came the 2 months of December and January, and the peasant movement continued its brisk growth. By the end of January, the membership must have reached at least 2 million. As a family generally enters only one name when joining and has an average of 5 members, the mass following must be about 10 million. This astonishing and accelerating rate of expansion explains why the local tyrants, evil gentry, and corrupt officials have been isolated, why the public has been amazed at how completely the world has changed since the peasant movement, and why a great revolution has been wrought in the countryside. This is the first great achievement of the peasants under the leadership of their associations. And there's a footnote off of that achievement. Yuan Suming was a warlord of Kwaichou province who controlled the western part of Hunan. Number 2, hitting the landlords politically. Once the peasants have their organization, the first thing they do is to smash the political prestige and power of the landlord class, and especially of the local tyrants and evil gentry. That is, to pull down landlord authority and build up peasant authority in rural society. This is a most serious and vital struggle. It is the pivotal struggle in the second period, the period of revolutionary action. Without victory in this struggle, no victory is possible in the economic struggle to reduce rent and interest, to secure land and other means of production, and so on. In many places in Hunan, like Xiangxiang, Hengshan, and Xiangdan counties, this is of course no problem, since the authority of the landlords has been overturned, and the peasants constitute the sole authority. But in counties like Liling, there are still some places, such as Liling's western and southern districts, where the authority of the landlord seems weaker than that of the peasants, but, because the political struggle has not been sharp, is in fact surreptitiously competing with it. In such places it is still too early to say that the peasants have gained political victory. They must wage the political struggle more vigorously until the landlord's authority is completely smashed. All in all, the methods used by the peasants to hit the landlords politically are as follows. Checking the accounts. More often than not, the local tyrants and evil gentry have helped themselves to public money passing through their hands, and their books are not in order. Now the peasants are using the checking of accounts as an occasion to bring down a great many of the local tyrants and evil gentry. In many places, committees for checking accounts have been established for the express purpose of settling financial scores with them, and the first sign of such a committee makes them shudder. Campaigns of this kind have been carried out in all the counties where the peasant movement is active. They are important not so much for recovering money as for publicizing the crimes of the local tyrants and evil gentry, and for knocking them down from their political and social positions. Imposing fines. The peasants work out fines for such offenses as irregularities revealed by the checking of accounts, past outrages against the peasants, current activities which undermine the peasant associations, violations of the ban on gambling, and refusal to surrender opium pipes. This local tyrant must pay so much, that member of the evil gentry so much, the sums ranging from tens to thousands of yuan. Naturally, a man who has been fined by the peasants completely loses face. Levying contributions. The unscrupulous rich landlords are made to contribute for poor relief, for the organization of cooperatives or peasant credit societies, or for other purposes. Though milder than fines, these contributions are also a form of punishment. To avoid trouble, quite a number of landlords make voluntary contributions to the peasant associations. Minor protests. When someone harms a peasant association by word or deed, and the offense is a minor one, the peasants collect in a crowd and swarm into the offender's house to remonstrate with him. He is usually let off after writing a pledge to cease and desist, in which he explicitly undertakes to stop defaming the peasant association in the future. Major demonstrations. A big crowd is rallied to demonstrate against a local tyrant or one of the evil gentry who is an enemy of the association. The demonstrators eat at the offender's house, slaughtering his pigs and consuming his grain as a matter of course. Quite a few such cases have occurred. There was a case recently at Machaho, Xiangdan County, where a crowd of 15,000 peasants went to the houses of 6 of the evil gentry and demonstrated. The whole affair lasted 4 days, during which more than 130 pigs were killed and eaten. After such demonstrations, the peasants usually impose fines. Crowning the landlords and parading them through the villages. This sort of thing is very common. A tall paper hat is stuck on the head of one of the local tyrants or evil gentry, bearing the words, "Local tyrant so-and-so," or "so-and-so of the evil gentry." He's led by a rope and escorted with big crowds in front and behind. Sometimes brass gongs are beaten and flags waved to attract people's attention. This form of punishment, more than any other, makes the local tyrants and evil gentry tremble. Anyone who has been crowned with a tall paper hat loses face altogether and can never again hold up his head. Hence many of the rich prefer being fined to wearing the tall hat, but wear it they must if the peasants insist. One ingenious township peasant association arrested an obnoxious member of the gentry and announced that he was going to be crowned that very day. The man turned blue with fear. Then the association decided not to crown him that day. They argued that if he were crowned right away, he would become case-hardened and no longer afraid, and that it would be better to let him go home and crown him some other day. Not knowing when he would be crowned, the man was in daily suspense, unable to sit down or sleep at ease. That's ingenious. Locking up the landlords in the county jail. This is a heavier punishment than wearing the tall paper hat. A local tyrant or one of the evil gentry is arrested and sent to the county jail. He's locked up, and the county magistrate has to try him and punish him. Today, the people who are locked up are no longer the same. Formerly, it was the gentry who sent peasants to be locked up. Now, it's the other way around. Banishment. The peasants have no desire to banish the most notorious criminals among the local tyrants and evil gentry, but would rather arrest or execute them. Afraid of being arrested or executed, they run away. In counties where the peasant movement is well developed, almost all the important local tyrants and evil gentry have fled, and this amounts to banishment. Among them, the top ones have fled to Shanghai, those of the second rank to Hankow, those of the third to Changsha, and of the fourth to the county towns. Of all the fugitive local tyrants and evil gentry, those who have fled to Shanghai are the safest. Some of those who fled to Hankow, like the three from Huazhong, were eventually captured and brought back. Those who fled to Changsha are still in greater danger of being seized at any moment by students in the provincial capital who hail from their counties. I myself saw 2 captured in Changsha. Those who have taken refuge in the county towns are only of the 4th rank, and the peasantry, having many eyes and ears, can easily track them down. The financial authorities once explained the difficulties encountered by the Hunan provincial government in raising money by the fact that the peasants were banishing the well-to-do, which gives some idea of the extent to which the local tyrants and evil gentry are not tolerated in their home villages. Execution. This is confined to the worst local tyrants and evil gentry, and is carried out by the peasants jointly with other sections of the people. For instance, Yang Chitze of Ningxian, Zhou Qiakan of Yueyang, and Fu Daonan and Sun Pochu of Huazhong were shot by the government authorities at the insistence of the peasants and the other sections of the people. In the case of Yan Zhongqiu of Xiangtan, the peasants and other sections of the people compelled the magistrate to agree to hand him over, and the peasants themselves executed him. Liu Chao of Ningxian was killed by the peasants. The execution of Peng Qifan of Liling and Chou Dianchue and Cao Yun of Yiyang is pending, subject to the decision of the special tribunal for trying local tyrants and evil gentry. The execution of one such big landlord reverberates throughout a whole county and is very effective in eradicating the remaining evils of feudalism. Every county has these major tyrants, some as many as several dozen, and others at least a few, and the only effective way of suppressing the reactionaries is to execute at least a few in each county who are guilty of the most heinous crimes. When the local tyrants and evil gentry were at the height of their power, they literally slaughtered peasants without batting an eyelid. Ho Maichuan, for 10 years head of the defense corps in the town of Xinkang, Changsha County, was personally responsible for killing almost 1,000 poverty-stricken peasants, which he euphemistically described as executing bandits. In my native county of Xingtan, Tang Yunchun and Lo Shulin, who headed the defense corps in the town of Yindian, have killed more than 50 people and buried 4 alive in the 14 years since 1913. Of the more than 50 they murdered, the first 2 were perfectly innocent beggars. Dang Yunchen said, "Let me start by killing a couple of beggars," and so these 2 lives were snuffed out. Such was the cruelty of the local tyrants and the evil gentry in the former days. Such was the white terror they created in the countryside. And now that the peasants have risen and shot a few and created just a little terror in suppressing the counter-revolutionaries. Is there any reason for saying they should not do so? Quick note there, when he writes the white terror, white is generally the color of counter-revolution. 3. Hitting the landlords economically. Prohibition on sending grain out of the area, forcing up grain prices, and hoarding and cornering. This is one of the great events of recent months in the economic struggle of the Hunan peasants. Since last October, the poor peasants have prevented the outflow of the grain of the landlords and rich peasants, and have banned the forcing up of grain prices and hoarding and cornering. As a result, the poor peasants have fully achieved their objective. The ban on the outflow of grain is watertight. Grain prices have fallen considerably, and hoarding and cornering have disappeared. Prohibition on increasing rents and deposits. Agitation for reduced rents and deposits. And there's a footnote there about that. A tenant generally gave his landlord, as a condition of tenancy, a deposit in cash or kind, often amounting to a considerable part of the value of the land. Though this was supposed to be a guarantee for payment of rent, it actually represented a form of extra exploitation. Last July and August, when the peasant associations were still weak, the landlords, following their long-established practice of maximum exploitation, served notice one after the other on their tenants that rents and deposits would be increased. But by October, when the peasant associations had grown considerably in strength and had all come out against the raising of rents and deposits, the landlords dare not breathe another word on the subject. From November onwards, as the peasants have gained ascendancy over the landlords, they have taken the further step of agitating for reduced rents and deposits. What a pity, they say, that the peasant associations were not strong enough when rents were being paid last autumn, or we could have reduced them then. The peasants are doing extensive propaganda for rent reduction in the coming autumn, and the landlords are asking how the reductions are to be carried out. As for the reduction of deposits, this is already underway in Hunan and other counties. Prohibition on canceling tenancies. In July and August of last year, there were still many instances of landlords canceling tenancies and re-letting the land. But after October, nobody dared cancel a tenancy. Today, the canceling of tenancies and the re-letting of land are quite out of the question. All that remains as something of a problem is whether a tenancy can be canceled if the landlord wants to cultivate the land himself. In some places, even this is not allowed by the peasants. In others, the canceling of a tenancy may be permitted if the landlord wants to cultivate the land himself, but then the problem of unemployment among the tenant peasants arises. There is as yet no uniform way of solving this problem. Reduction of interest. Interest has been generally reduced in Anhua, and there have been reductions in other counties too. But wherever the peasant associations are powerful, rural money lending has virtually disappeared, the landlords having completely stopped lending for fear that the money will be communized. What is currently called reduction of interest is confined to old loans. Not only is the interest on such old loans reduced, but the creditor is actually forbidden to press for the repayment of the principal. The poor peasant replies, "Don't blame me, the year is nearly over, I'll pay you back next year." 4. Overthrowing the feudal rule of the local tyrants and evil gentry, smashing the du and duan. There's a footnote there. In Hunan, the du corresponded to the district and the duan to the township. The old administrations of the du and the duan type were instruments of landlord rule. The old organs of political power in the du and duan, i.e. the district and the township, and especially at the du level, just below the county level, used to be almost exclusively in the hands of the local tyrants and evil gentry. The du had jurisdiction over a population of from 10 to 50 or 60,000 people, and had its own armed forces, such as the Township Defense Corps, its own fiscal powers, such as the power to levy taxes per mu of land, and its own judicial powers, such as the power to arrest, imprison, try, and punish the peasants at will. And there's a footnote there. The tax per mu was a surcharge on top of the regular Lent tax, ruthlessly imposed on the peasants by the landlord regime. The evil gentry who ran these organs were virtual monarchs of the countryside. Comparatively speaking, the peasants were not so much concerned with the President of the Republic, the provincial military governor, or the county magistrate. Their real bosses were these rural monarchs. There's a footnote there. Under the regime of the northern warlords, the military head of a province was called the military governor, but he was the virtual dictator of the province, with administrative as well as military power gathered in his hands. In league with the imperialists, he maintained a separatist, feudal militarist regime in his locality. A mere snort from these people, and the peasants knew they had to watch their step. As a consequence of the present revolt in the countryside, the authority of the landlord class has generally been struck down, and the organs of rural administration, dominated by the local tyrants and evil gentry, have naturally collapsed in its wake. The heads of the du and the douane all steer clear of the people, dare not show their faces, and push all local matters on to the peasant associations. They put off people with the remark, "It's none of my business." Whenever their conversation turns to the heads of the du and the douane, the peasants say angrily, "That bunch, they're finished." Yes, the term finished truly describes the state of the old organs of rural administration wherever the storm of revolution has raged. 5. Overthrowing the armed forces of the landlords and re-establishing those of the peasants. The armed forces of the landlord class were smaller in central Hunan than in the western and southern parts of the province. An average of 600 rifles for each county would make a total of 45,000 rifles for all the 75 counties. There may in fact be more. In the southern and central parts, where the peasant movement is well developed, the landlord class cannot hold its own because of the tremendous momentum with which the peasants have risen, and its armed forces have largely capitulated to the peasant associations and taken the side of the peasants. Examples of this are to be found in such counties as Ningxian, Pingqiang, Liuyang, Changsha, Liling, Qiangdan, Jiangxiang, Anhua, Hengshan, and Hengyang. In some counties, such as Baoqing, a small number of the landlord's armed forces are taking a neutral stand, though with a tendency to capitulate. Another small section are opposing the peasant associations, but the peasants are attacking them, and may wipe them out before long, as, for example, in such counties as Yichang, Linwu, and Qiaho. The armed forces thus taken over from the reactionary landlords are all being reorganized into a standing household militia and placed under the new organs of rural self-government, which are the organs of the political power of the peasantry. And there's a footnote there. The standing household militia was one of the various kinds of armed forces in the countryside. The term household is used because some member of almost every household had to join it. After the defeat of the revolution in 1927, the landlords in many places seized control of the militia and turned them into armed counter-revolutionary bands. Taking over these old armed forces is one way in which the peasants are building up their own armed forces. A new way is through the setting up of spear corps under the peasant associations. The spears have pointed, double-edged blades mounted on long shafts, and there are now 100,000 of these weapons in the county of Xiangsang alone. Other counties like Xiangdan, Hengshan, Liling, and Changsha have 70,000 to 80,000, or 50,000 to 60,000, or 30,000 to 40,000 each. Every county where there is a peasant movement has a rapidly growing spear corps. These peasants, thus armed, form an irregular household militia. This multitude, equipped with spears, which is larger than the old armed forces mentioned above, is a newborn armed power, the mere sight of which makes the local tyrants and evil gentry tremble. The revolutionary authorities in Hunan should see to it that it is built up on a really extensive scale among the more than 20 million peasants in the 75 counties of the province, that every peasant, whether young or in his prime, possesses a spear, and that no restrictions are imposed as though a spear were something dreadful. Anyone who is scared at the sight of the spear corps is indeed a weakling. Only the local tyrants and evil gentry are frightened of them, but no revolutionary should take fright. 6. Overthrowing the political power of the county magistrate and his bailiffs. That county government cannot be clean until the peasants rise up was proved some time ago in Haifeng, Guangdong province. Now we have added proof, particularly in Hunan. In a county where power is in the hands of the local tyrants and evil gentry, the magistrate, whoever he may be, is almost invariably a corrupt official. In a county where the peasants have risen, there is clean government, whoever the magistrate. In the counties I visited, the magistrates had to consult the peasant associations on everything in advance. In counties where the peasant power was very strong, the word of the peasant association worked miracles. If it demanded the arrest of a local tyrant in the morning, The magistrate dared not delay till noon. If it demanded arrest by noon, he dared not delay till the afternoon. When the power of the peasants was just beginning to make itself felt in the countryside, the magistrate worked in league with the local tyrants and the evil gentry against the peasants. When the peasants' power grew until it matched that of the landlords, the magistrate took the position of trying to accommodate both the landlords and the peasants, accepting some of the peasant association's suggestions while rejecting others. The remark that the word of the peasant association works miracles applies only when the power of the landlords has been completely beaten down by that of the peasants. At present, the political situation in such counties as Xiangxiang, Xiangdan, Liling, and Hengshan is as follows. 1. All decisions are made by a joint council consisting of the magistrate and the representatives of the revolutionary mass organizations. The council is convened by the magistrate and meets in his office. In some counties, it is called the Joint Council of Public Bodies and the Local Government, and in others, the Council of County Affairs. Besides the magistrate himself, the people attending are the representatives of the County Peasant Association, Trade Union Council, Merchant Association, Women's Association, School Staff Association, Student Association, and Kuomintang Headquarters. And there's a footnote there. At the time, many of the county headquarters of the Kuomintang, under the leadership of the Kuomintang Central Executive Committee in Wuhan, pursued Dr. Sun Yat-sen's three great policies of alliance with Russia, cooperation with the Communist Party, and assistance to the peasants and workers. They constituted the Revolutionary Alliance of the Communists, the left-wingers of the Kuomintang, and other revolutionaries. At such council meetings, the magistrate is influenced by the views of the public organizations and invariably does their bidding. The adoption of a democratic committee system of county government should not, therefore, present much of a problem in Hunan. The present county governments are already quite democratic, both in form and substance. This situation has been brought about only in the last 2 or 3 months. That is, since the peasants have risen all over the countryside and overthrown the power of the local tyrants and evil gentry. It has now come about that the magistrates, seeing their old props collapse and needing other props to retain their posts, have begun to curry favor with the public organizations. 2. The judicial assistant has scarcely any cases to handle. The judicial system in Hunan remains one in which the county magistrate is concurrently in charge of judicial affairs, with an assistant to help him in handling cases. To get rich, the magistrate and his underlings used to rely entirely on collecting taxes and levies, procuring men and provisions for the armed forces, and extorting money in civil and criminal lawsuits by confounding right and wrong, the last being the most regular and reliable source of income. In the last few months, with the downfall of the local tyrants and evil gentry, all the legal pettifoggers have disappeared. What's more, the peasants' problems, big and small, are now all settled in the peasant associations at the various levels. Thus, the county judicial assistant simply has nothing to do. The one in Xiangxiang told me, when there were no peasant associations, an average of 60 civil or criminal suits were brought to the county government each day. Now it receives an average of only 4 or 5 a day. So it is that the purses of the magistrates and their underlings perforce remain empty. 3. The armed guards, the police, and the bailiffs all keep out of the way and dare not to go near the villages to practice their extortions. In the past, the villagers were afraid of the townspeople, but now the townspeople are afraid of the villagers. In particular, the vicious curs kept by the county government, the police, the armed guards, and the bailiffs, are afraid of going to the villages, or if they do so, they no longer dare to practice their extortions. They tremble at the sight of the peasants' spears. 7. Overthrowing the clan authority of the ancestral temples and clan elders, the religious authority of town and village gods, and the masculine authority of husbands. Let me underline that last one again, the masculine authority of husbands. A man in China is usually subjected to the domination of 3 systems of authority. 1. The state system, political authority, ranging from the national, provincial, and county government down to that of the township. 2. The den system, clan authority, ranging from the central ancestral temple and its branch temples down to the head of the household. And 3. The supernatural system, religious authority, ranging from the king of hell down to the town and village gods belonging to the netherworld, and from the emperor of heaven down to all the various gods and spirits belonging to the celestial world. As for women, In addition to being dominated by these three systems of authority, they are also dominated by men, the authority of the husband. These four authorities, political, clan, religious, and masculine, are the embodiment of the whole feudal patriarchal system and ideology, and are the four thick ropes binding the Chinese people, particularly the peasants. How the peasants have overthrown the political authority of the landlords in the countryside has been described above. The political authority of the landlords is the backbone of all the other systems of authority. With that overturned, the clan authority, the religious authority, and the authority of the husband all begin to totter. Where the peasant association is powerful, the den elders and administrators of temple funds no longer dare oppress those lower in the clan hierarchy or embezzle clan funds. The worst clan elders and administrators, being local tyrants, have been thrown out. No one any longer dares to practice the cruel corporal and capital punishments that used to be inflicted in the ancestral temples, such as flogging, drowning, and burying alive. The old rule, barring women and poor people from the banquets in the ancestral temples, has also been broken. The women of Paikno in Hungshan County gathered in force and swarmed into their ancestral temple, firmly planting their backsides in the seats, and joined in the eating and drinking, while the venerable den bigwigs had willy-nilly to let them do as they pleased. At another place, where poor peasants had been excluded from temple banquets, a group of them flocked in and ate and drank their fill, while the local tyrants and evil gentry and other long-gowned gentlemen all took to their heels in fright. Everywhere, religious authority totters as the peasant movement develops. In many places, the peasant associations have taken over the temples of the gods as their offices. Everywhere, they advocate the appropriation of temple property in order to start peasant schools and to defray the expenses of the associations, calling it public revenue from superstition. In Liling County, prohibiting superstitious practices and smashing idols have become quite the vogue. In its northern districts, the peasants have prohibited the incense-burning processions to propitiate the god of pestilence. There were many idols in the Taoist temple at Fupoling in Lukou, but when extra room was needed for the district headquarters of the Kuomintang, they were all piled up in a corner, big and small together, and no peasant raised any objection. Since then, sacrifices to the gods, the performance of religious rites, and the offering of sacred lamps have rarely been practiced when a death occurs in a family. Because the initiative in this matter was taken by the chairman of the Peasant Association, Sun Xiaoshan, he is hated by the local Taoist priests. In the Lungfun Nunnery, in the North 3rd District, the peasants and primary school teachers chopped up the wooden idols and actually used the wood to cook meat. More than 30 idols in the Dongfu Monastery in the Southern District were burned by the students and peasants together, and only 2 small images of Lord Pao were snatched up by an old peasant who said, "Don't commit a sin." Footnote there, Lord Pao, Pao Chung, was the prefect of Kaifeng, capital of the northern Sung dynasty. He was famous in popular legend as an upright official and a fearless, impartial judge with a knack of passing true verdicts in all the cases he tried. Back to the text. In places where the power of the peasants is predominant, only the older peasants and the women still believe in the gods, the younger peasants no longer doing so. Since the latter control the associations, the overthrow of religious authority and the eradication of superstition are going on everywhere. As to the authority of the husband, this has always been weaker among the poor peasants because, out of economic necessity, their womenfolk have to do more manual labor than the women of the richer classes, and therefore have more say and greater power of decision in family matters. With the increasing bankruptcy of the rural economy in recent years, the basis for men's domination over women has already been weakened. With the rise of the peasant movement, the women in many places have now begun to organize rural women's associations. The opportunity has come for them to lift up their heads, and the authority of the husband is getting shakier every day. In a word, the whole feudal patriarchal system and ideology is tottering with the growth of the peasants' power. At the present time, however, the peasants are concentrating on destroying the landlord's political authority. Wherever it has been wholly destroyed, they are beginning to press their attack in the other 3 spheres of the clan, the gods, and the male domination. But such attacks have only just begun, and there can be no thorough overthrow of all 3 until the peasants have won complete victory in the economic struggle. Therefore, our present task is to lead the peasants to put their greatest efforts into the political struggle so that the landlord's authority is entirely overthrown. The economic struggle should follow immediately, so that the land problem, and the other economic problems of the poor peasants may be fundamentally solved. As for the den system, superstition, and inequality between men and women, their abolition will follow as a natural consequence of victory in the political and economic struggles. If too much of an effort is made, arbitrarily and prematurely, to abolish these things, the local tyrants and evil gentry will seize the pretext to put about such counter-revolutionary propaganda as the Peasant Association has no piety towards ancestors, the Peasant Association is blasphemous and destroying religion, and the Peasant Association stands for the communization of wives, all for the purpose of undermining the peasant movement. A case in point is the recent events at Xiangxiang in Hunan and Yangxin in Hubei, where the landlords exploited the opposition of some peasants to smashing idols. It is the peasants who made the idols, and when the time comes, they will cast the idols aside with their own hands. There's no need for anyone else for them to do it prematurely. The Communist Party's propaganda policy in such matters should be, draw the bow without shooting, just indicate the motions. It is for the peasants themselves to cast aside the idols, pull down the temples to the martyred virgins, and the arches to the chaste and faithful widows. It is wrong for anybody else to do it for them. There is a footnote there. This reference to archery is taken from Mencius. It describes how the expert teacher of archery draws his bow with a histrionic gesture, but does not release the arrow. The point is that while communists should guide the peasants in attaining a full measure of political consciousness, they should leave it to the peasants' own initiative to abolish superstitious and other bad practices, and should not give them orders or do it for them. Back to the main text. While I was in the countryside, I did some propaganda against superstition among the peasants. I said, if you believe in the 8 characters, you hope for good luck. If you believe in geomancy, you hope to benefit from the location of your ancestral graves. A couple of footnotes there. The 8 characters were a method of fortune-telling in China based on the examination of the 2 cyclic characters, each for the year, month, day, and hour of a person's birth, respectively. And geomancy refers to the superstition that the location of one's ancestors' graves influences one's fortune. The geomancers claim to be able to tell whether a particular site and its surroundings are auspicious. Back to the text. This year, within the space of a few months, the local tyrants, evil gentry, and corrupt officials have all toppled from their pedestals. Is it possible that until a few months ago they all had good luck and enjoyed the benefit of well-sited ancestral graves, while suddenly in the last few months their luck has turned and their ancestral graves have ceased to exert a beneficial influence? The local tyrants and evil gentry jeer at your peasant associations, say, how odd. Today, the world is a world of committee men. Look, you can't even go to pass water without bumping into a committee man. Quite true. The towns and the villages, the trade unions and the peasant associations, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, all without exception, have their executive committee members. It is indeed a world of committee men. But is this due to the 8 characters and the location of the ancestral graves? How strange. The 8 characters of all the poor wretches in the countryside have suddenly turned auspicious, and their ancestral graves have suddenly started exerting beneficial influences. The gods? Worship them, by all means. But if you had only Lord Kuan and the Goddess of Mercy and no peasant association, could you have overthrown the local tyrants and evil gentry? The gods and goddesses are indeed miserable objects. You have worshipped them for centuries, and they have not overthrown a single one of the local tyrants or evil gentry for you. Now you want to have your rent reduced. Let me ask, how will you go about it? Will you believe in the gods or in the peasant association? My words made the peasants roar with laughter. There's a footnote there. Lord Kuan was a warrior in the Epic of the Three Kingdoms. He was widely worshipped by the Chinese as the god of loyalty and of war. 8. Spreading political propaganda. Even if 10,000 schools of law and political science had been opened, could they have brought as much political education to the people, men and women, young and old, all the way into the remotest corners of the countryside, as the peasant associations have done, in so short a time? I don't think they could. Down with imperialism, down with the warlords, down with the corrupt officials, down with the local tyrants and evil gentry. These political slogans have grown wings. They have found their way to the young, the middle-aged, and the old, to the women and children in countless villages. They have penetrated into their minds and are on their lips. For instance, watch a group of children at play. If one gets angry with another, if he glares, stamps his foot, and shakes his fist, you will then immediately hear from the other the shrill cry of "Down with imperialism." In the Xiangdan area, when the children who pasture the cattle get into a fight, one will act as Dong Shengqi and the other as Ye Kaixin. When one is defeated and runs away, with the other chasing him, it is the pursuer who is Dong Shengqi and the pursued Ye Kaixin. As to the song, "Down with the Imperialist Powers," of course almost every child in the towns can sing it, and now many village children can sing it too. And there's a footnote there. Dong Shengqi was a general who sided with the revolution in the northern expedition. Ye Kaixin was a general on the side of the northern warlords who fought against the revolution. Back to the text. Some of the peasants can also recite Dr. Sun Yat-sen's statement. They pick out the terms freedom, equality, the three people's principles, and unequal treaties, and apply them, if rather crudely, in their daily life. When somebody who looks like one of the gentry encounters a peasant and stands on his dignity, refusing to make way along a pathway, the peasant will say angrily, "Hey, you local tyrant, don't you know the three people's principles?" Formerly, when the peasants from the vegetable farms on the outskirts of Changsha entered the city to sell their produce, they used to be pushed around by the police. Now they found a weapon, which is none other than the three people's principles. When a policeman strikes or swears at a peasant selling vegetables, the peasant immediately answers back by invoking the three people's principles, and that shuts the policeman up. Once in Xiangdan, when a district peasant association and a township peasant association couldn't see eye to eye, the chairman of the township association declared, "Down with the district peasant association's unequal treaties." The spread of political propaganda throughout the rural areas is entirely an achievement of the Communist Party and the peasant associations. Simple slogans, cartoons, and speeches have produced such a widespread and speedy effect among the peasants that every one of them seems to have been through a political school. According to the reports of comrades engaged in rural work, political propaganda was very extensive at the time of the three great mass rallies, the anti-British demonstration, the celebration of the October Revolution, and the victory celebration for the Northern Expedition. On these occasions, political propaganda was conducted extensively wherever there were peasant associations, arousing the whole countryside with tremendous effect. From now on, care should be taken to use every opportunity gradually to enrich the content and clarify the meaning of those simple slogans. 9. Peasant bans and prohibitions. When the peasant associations, under Communist Party leadership, establish their authority in the countryside, the peasants begin to prohibit or restrict the things they dislike. Gambling, gaming, and opium smoking are the three things that are most strictly forbidden. Gaming. Where the peasant association is powerful, mahjong, dominoes, and card games are completely banned. The peasant association in the 14th district of Xiangxiang burned 2 basketfuls of mahjong sets. If you go to the countryside, you will find none of these games played. Anyone who violates the ban is promptly and strictly banished. Gambling. Former hardened gamblers are now themselves suppressing gambling. This abuse, too, has been swept away in places where the peasant association is powerful. Opium smoking. The prohibition is extremely strict. When the peasant association orders the surrender of opium pipes, no one dares to raise the least objection. In Liling County, one of the evil gentry who did not surrender his pipes was arrested and paraded through the villages. The peasants' campaign to disarm the opium smokers is no less impressive than the disarming of the troops of Wu Peifu and Sun Chuanfang by the Northern Expeditionary Army. There's a footnote there. Sun Chuanfang was a warlord whose rule extended over the 5 provinces of Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, Jiangsu, and Anhui. He was responsible for the bloody suppression of the insurrections of the Shanghai workers. His main army was crushed in the winter of 1926 by the Northern Expeditionary Army in Nanchang and Quqiang, Jiangsu province. Back to the text. Quite a number of venerable fathers of officers in the Revolutionary Army, old men who were opium addicts and inseparable from their pipes, have been disarmed by the emperors, as the peasants are called derisively by the evil gentry. The emperors have banned not only the growing and smoking of opium, but also trafficking in it. A great deal of the opium transported from Kwaichao to Jiangsu via the counties of Baoqing, Xiangxiang, Yuxian, and Liling, has been intercepted on the way and burned. This has affected government revenues. As a result, out of consideration for the army's need for funds in the northern expedition, the Provincial Peasant Association ordered the associations at the lower levels temporarily to postpone the ban on opium traffic. This, however, has upset and displeased the peasants. There are many other things besides these three which the peasants have prohibited or restricted, the following being some examples. The flower drum. Vulgar performances are forbidden in many places. Sedan chairs. In many counties, especially Xiangxiang, there have been cases of smashing sedan chairs. The peasants, detesting the people who use this conveyance, are always ready to smash the chairs, but the peasant associations forbid them to do so. Association officials tell the peasants, if you smash the chairs, you only save the rich money and lose the carriers their jobs. Will that not hurt our own people? Seeing the point, the peasants have worked out a new tactic, considerably to increase the fares charged by the chair carriers, so as to penalize the rich. Distilling and sugar making. The use of grain for distilling spirits and making sugar is everywhere prohibited, and the distillers and sugar refiners are constantly complaining. Distilling is not banned in Futianpu, Hungshan County, but prices are fixed very low, and the wine and spirits dealers, seeing no prospect of profit, have had to stop it. Pigs. The number of pigs a family can keep is limited, for pigs consume grain. Chickens and ducks. In Xiangxiang County, the raising of chickens and ducks is prohibited, but the women object. In Hungshan County, each family in Yangdang is allowed to keep only 3, and in Futianpu 5. In many places, the raising of ducks is completely banned, for ducks not only consume grain, but also ruin the rice plants, and so are worse than chickens. Feasts. Sumptuous feasts are generally forbidden. In Shaoshan, Shandong County, it has been decided that guests are to be served with only 3 kinds of animal food, namely chicken, fish, and pork. It is also forbidden to serve bamboo shoots, kelp, and lentil noodles. In Hungshan County, it has been resolved that 8 dishes, and no more, may be served at a banquet. And there is a footnote there. In China, a dish is served in a bowl or a plate for the whole table, and not individually. Only 5 dishes are allowed in the East 3rd District in Liling County, and only 3 meat and 3 vegetable dishes in the North 2nd District, while in the West 3rd District, New Year feasts are forbidden entirely. In Xiangxiang County, there is a ban on all egg cake feasts, which are by no means sumptuous. When a family in the 2nd District of Xiangxiang gave an egg cake feast at a son's wedding, the peasants, seeing the ban violated, swarmed into the house and broke up the celebration. In the town of Qiamo, Xiangxiang County, the people have refrained from eating expensive foods and use only fruit when offering ancestral sacrifices. Oxen. Oxen are a treasured possession of the peasants. Slaughter an ox in this life, and you will be an ox in the next, has become almost a religious tenet. Oxen must never be killed. Before the peasants had power, they could only appeal to religious taboo in opposing the slaughter of cattle, and had no means of banning it. Since the rise of the peasant associations, their jurisdiction has extended even to the cattle, and they have prohibited the slaughter of cattle in the towns. Of the 6 butcheries in the county town of Xiangdan, 5 are now closed, and the remaining one slaughters only enfeebled or disabled animals. The slaughter of cattle is now totally prohibited throughout the county of Hungshan. A peasant whose ox broke a leg consulted the peasant association before he dared kill it. When the Chamber of Commerce of Chuchao rashly slaughtered a cow, the peasants came into town and demanded an explanation, and the chamber, besides paying a fine, had to let off firecrackers by way of apology. Tramps and vagabonds. A resolution passed in Liling County prohibited the drumming of New Year greetings, or the chanting of praises to the local deities, or the singing of lotus rhymes. Various other counties have similar prohibitions, or these practices have disappeared of themselves, as no one observes them anymore. The beggar bullies, or vagabonds, who used to be extremely aggressive, now have no alternative but to submit to the peasant associations. In Shaoshan, Shandong County, the vagabonds used to make the temple of the rain god their regular haunt, and feared nobody, but since the rise of the associations they have stolen away. The peasant association in Huti Township, in the same county, caught 3 such tramps, and made them carry clay for the brick kilns. resolutions have been passed prohibiting the wasteful customs associated with New Year calls and gifts. Besides these, many other minor prohibitions have been introduced in various places, such as the Liling prohibitions on incense-burning processions to propitiate the god of pestilence, on buying preserves and fruit for ritual presents, burning ritual paper garments during the Festival of Spirits, and pasting up good luck posters at the New Year in Kushui in Xiangshan County. There is a prohibition even on smoking water pipes. In the 2nd District, letting off firecrackers and ceremonial guns is forbidden, with a fine of 1.2 yuan for the former and 2.4 yuan for the latter. Religious rites for the dead are prohibited in the 7th and 20th districts. In the 18th district, it is forbidden to make funeral gifts of money. Things like these, which defy enumeration, may be generally called peasant bans and prohibitions. They are of great significance in 2 respects. First, they represent a revolt against bad social customs, such as gaming, gambling, and opium smoking. These customs arose out of the rotten political environment of the landlord class and are swept away once its authority is overthrown. Second, the prohibitions are a form of self-defense against exploitation by city merchants. Such are the prohibitions on feasts and on buying preserves and fruit for ritual presents. Manufactured goods are extremely dear, and agricultural products are extremely cheap. The peasants are impoverished and ruthlessly exploited by the merchants, and they must therefore encourage frugality to protect themselves. As for the ban on sending grain out of the area, it is imposed to prevent the price from rising because the poor peasants have not enough to feed themselves and have to buy grain on the market. The reason for all this is the peasants' poverty and the contradictions between town and country. It is not a matter of their rejecting manufactured goods or trade between town and country in order to uphold the so-called doctrine of Oriental culture. And there is a footnote there. Oriental culture was a reactionary doctrine which rejected modern scientific civilization and favored the preservation of the backward mode of agricultural production and the feudal culture of the Orient. Back to the text. To protect themselves economically, the peasants must organize consumers' cooperatives for the collective buying of goods. It is also necessary for the government to help the peasant associations to establish credit or loan cooperatives. If these things were done, the peasants would naturally find it unnecessary to ban the outflow of grain as a method of keeping down the price, nor would they have to prohibit the inflow of certain manufactured goods in economic self-defense. 10. Eliminating banditry. In my opinion, no ruler in any dynasty, from Yu, Dong, Wen, and Wu, down to the Qing emperors and the presidents of the Republic, has ever shown as much prowess in eliminating banditry as have the peasant associations today. Wherever the peasant associations are powerful, there is not a trace of banditry. Surprisingly enough, in many places even the pilfering of vegetables has disappeared. In other places, there are still some pilferers, but in the counties I visited, even including those that were formerly bandit-ridden, there was no trace of bandits. The reasons are, first, the members of the peasant associations are everywhere spread out over the hills and dales, spear or cudgel in hand, ready to go into action in their hundreds, so that the bandits have nowhere to hide. Second, since the rise of the peasant movement, the price of grain has dropped. It was 6 yuan a pickle last spring, but only 2 yuan last winter, and the problem of food has become less serious for the people. Third, members of the secret societies have joined the peasant associations, in which they can openly and legally play the hero and vent their grievances, so that there is no further need for the secret mountain, lodge, shrine, and river forms of organization. A couple of footnotes there. For the secret societies, see Analysis of the Classes in Chinese Society. We have that up on the channel. And also mountain, lodge, shrine, and river were names used by primitive secret societies to denote some of their sects. And, of course, we see that to this day. You know, the Shriners and all the different forms of the Freemasonic lodges and things like that. Back to the text. In killing the pigs and shrine of the local tyrants and evil gentry and imposing heavy levies and fines, they have adequate outlets for their feelings against those who have oppressed them. Fourth, the armies are recruiting large numbers of soldiers, and many of the unruly have joined up. Thus, the evil of banditry has ended with the rise of the peasant movement. On this point, even the well-to-do approve of the peasant associations. Their comment is, the peasant associations? Well, to be fair, there is also something to be said for them. in prohibiting gaming, gambling, and opium smoking, and in eliminating banditry. The peasant associations have won general approval. 11. Abolishing exorbitant levies. As the country is not yet unified, and the authority of the imperialists and the warlords has not been overthrown, there is as yet no way of removing the heavy burden of government taxes and levies on the peasants, or more explicitly, of removing the burden of expenditure for the Revolutionary Army. However, the exorbitant levies imposed on the peasants when the local tyrants and evil gentry dominated rural administration, e.g. the surcharge on each mu of land, have been abolished or at least reduced with the rise of the peasant movement and the downfall of the local tyrants and evil gentry. This too should be counted among the achievements of the peasant associations. 12. The movement for education. In China, education has always been the exclusive preserve of the landlords, and the peasants have had no access to it. But the landlord's culture is created by the peasants, for its sole source is the peasants' sweat and blood. In China, 90% of the people have had no education, and of these, the overwhelming majority are peasants. The moment the power of the landlords was overthrown in the rural areas, the peasants' movement for education began. See how the peasants who hitherto detested the schools are today zealously setting up evening classes. They always disliked the foreign-style school. In my student days, when I went back to the village and saw that the peasants were against the foreign-style school, I too used to identify myself with the general run of foreign-style students and teachers and stand up for it, feeling that the peasants were somehow wrong. It was not until 1925, when I lived in the countryside for 6 months and was already a communist and had acquired the Marxist viewpoint, that I realized I had been wrong and the peasants right. The texts used in the rural primary schools were entirely about urban things and unsuited to rural needs. Besides, the attitude of the primary school teachers toward the peasants was very bad, and far from being helpful to the peasants, they became objects of dislike. Hence, the peasants preferred the old-style schools, Chinese classes as they called them, to the modern schools, which they called foreign classes, and the old-style teachers to the ones in the primary schools. Now the peasants are enthusiastically establishing evening classes, which they call peasant schools. Some have already been opened, others are being organized, and on the average, there is one school per township. The peasants are very enthusiastic about these schools and regard them, and only them, as their own. The funds for the evening schools come from the public revenue from superstition, from ancestral temple funds, and from other idle public funds or property. The county education boards wafted to use this money to establish primary schools, that is, foreign-style schools, not suited to the needs of the peasants, while the latter wanted to use it for peasant schools. And the outcome of the dispute was that both got some of the money, though there are places where the peasants got it all. The development of the peasant movement has resulted in a rapid rise in their cultural level. Before long, tens of thousands of schools will have sprung up in the villages throughout the province. This is quite different from the empty talk about universal education, which the intelligentsia and the so-called educationalists have been bandying back and forth, and which after all this time remains an empty phrase. 13. The cooperative movement. The peasants really need cooperatives, and especially consumers, marketing, and credit cooperatives. When they buy goods, the merchants exploit them. When they sell their farm's produce, the merchants cheat them. When they borrow money for rice, they're fleeced by the usurers. And they're eager to find a solution to these three problems. During the fighting in the Yangtze Valley last winter, when trade routes were cut and the price of salt went up in Hunan, many peasants organized cooperatives to purchase salt. When the landlords deliberately stopped lending, there were many attempts by the peasants to organize credit agencies because they needed to borrow money. A major problem is the absence of detailed, standard rules of organization. As these spontaneously organized peasant cooperatives often fail to conform to cooperative principles, the comrades working among the peasants are always eagerly inquiring about rules and regulations. Given proper guidance, the cooperative movement can spread everywhere, along with the growth of the peasant associations. And 14. Building roads and repairing embankments. This too is one of the achievements of the peasant associations. Before there were peasant associations, the roads in the countryside were terrible. roads can't be repaired without money, and as the wealthy were unwilling to dip into their purses, the roads were left in a bad state. If there was any road work done at all, it was done as an act of charity. A little money was collected from families wishing to gain merit in the next world, and a few narrow, skimpily paved roads were built. Comment, it's the world libertarians want. With the rise of the peasant associations, orders have been given specifying the required width, 3, 5, 7, or 10 feet, according to the requirements of the different routes, and each landlord along a road has been ordered to build a section. Once the order is given, who dares to disobey? In a short time, many good roads have appeared. This is no work of charity, but the result of compulsion, and a little compulsion of this kind is not at all a bad thing. The same is true of the embankments. The ruthless landlords were always out to take what they could from the tenant peasants and would never spend even a few coppers on embankment repairs. They would leave the ponds to dry up and the tenant peasants to starve, caring about nothing but the rent. Now that there are peasant associations, the landlords can be bluntly ordered to repair the embankments. When a landlord refuses, the association will tell him politely, "Very well, if you won't do the repairs, you will contribute grain, a due for each workday." As this is a very bad bargain for the landlord, he hastens to do the repairs. Consequently, many defective embankments have been turned into good ones. All the 14 deeds enumerated above have been accomplished by the peasants under the leadership of the peasant associations. Would the reader please think it over and say whether any of them is bad in its fundamental spirit and revolutionary significance? Only the local tyrants and evil gentry, I think, will call them bad. Curiously enough, it is reported from Nanchang that Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Ching-chang, and other such gentlemen do not altogether approve of the activities of the Hunan peasants. This opinion is shared by Liu Yue-chi and other right-wing leaders in Hunan, all of whom say they have simply gone red. But where would the national revolution be without this bit of red? Comment, and of course they got much more than a bit in the end. To talk about arousing the masses of the people, day in and day out, and then to be scared to death when the masses do rise. What difference is there between this and Lord She's love of dragons? That's the end of the text, but there are a few footnotes off of the last paragraph. When Nanchang was captured by the Northern Expeditionary Army in November 1926, Chiang Kai-shek seized the opportunity to establish his general headquarters there. He gathered around himself the right-wing members of the Kuomintang and a number of northern warlord politicians, and, in collusion with the imperialists, hatched his counter-revolutionary plot against Wuhan, the then revolutionary center. Eventually, on April 12, 1927, he staged his counter-revolutionary coup d'etat, which was marked by tremendous massacres in Shanghai. Chiang Ching-chang, a right-wing Kuomintang leader, was a member of Chiang Kai-shek's brain trust. Liu Yue-chi was head of the Left Society, an important anti-communist group in Hunan. And finally, as told by Liu Xiang in his Xin Shu, Lord She was so fond of dragons that he adorned his whole palace with drawings and carvings of them. But when a real dragon heard of his infatuation and paid him a visit, he was frightened out of his wits. Here, Comrade Mao Zedong uses this metaphor to show that although Chiang Kai-shek and his like talked about revolution, they were afraid of revolution and against it. So that's the end of the text. I really like this one, and I don't really have further comments. I mean, it was just such a thorough, not really an ethnography, but I mean, this is a great field report of actually getting out there and making observations of what was going on in this area. So anyway, yeah, what do you think? Leave a comment below. We'll continue the discussion there. As I mentioned before, we'll be doing a number of other works, more of the significant works from Mao in the coming month or two. And I look forward to continuing this history. We've been doing a lot on the Russian struggles and Europe and the early Soviet Union. Now we're, with some of that a little bit better in hand, turning our attention to China. Obviously, we're going to continue with the Russian and Soviet history as well as we go, but now also folding in China a bit more into the mix. So thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. All of those donations are very encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so I appreciate those a lot. If you'd like to help out without making a donation, liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, clicking the notifications bell, all of that helps to boost the channel, helps more people to see this content, particularly sharing it on your social media. Otherwise, whatever you do, whether it has anything to do with S4A or not, in the struggle for socialism, thank you for doing it. Join an organization if there's a good one in your area because, you know, as Mao said here, it's not really a matter of, whether your ancestors are buried in the right place. It's did you form the association which has the strength in numbers to do what, you need to do. This is crucial. We do need organizations. We've also been plagued by lots of organizational problems, but we do need organizations. Or start that project of your own if maybe you have some friends and comrades who are of like mind and there's something you've been thinking about doing for a while. There are guides to starting various organizations and networks online. Thanks, and we will catch you in the next video.